that reads literally, "Not even when it abounds to him or her is a person's life made up of that which he or she possesses." The Greek noun in focus here is huparkonton. It's a participle used as a substantive from huparko, meaning to be. The semantic analogy in English would be belongings. Or to paraphrase, we think we are what we own. There's an intimate relationship that was understood in antiquity between having and being, and the temptation to be possessed by our possessions. This is used throughout Luke's Gospel. In particularly, it is huparkonton that disciples must ultimately renounce. That is, we must seek not to be possessed by our possessions. It is that which the strong man seeks to protect. And most importantly for the narrative logic of Luke, Zacchaeus distributes half of his huparkonton to the poor at the culmination of Luke's Gospel. And it is that which is redistributed by the Pentecostal Acts community. In other words, in Luke's cosmology, stuff exists only to build community. To illustrate this point, Jesus offers a story about a rich farmer. It was probably a well-known folk tale, since similar versions of this story appear in the earlier Wisdom of Sirach and Gospel of Thomas. This is one of 3 sobering Lucan parables about rich men. The other 2 are found in Luke 16, where they bookend Jesus' teaching on mammon. You get the sense that he's trying to make a point here. Luke's concern in these unflattering portraits, however, is not just to critique affluenza, but to assert an alternative to ruling class cosmology. Jesus begins spinning his alternative already in the parable, which begins, "The land of a rich man brought forth great fruit." Now, pay attention. This implies that the abundance resulted from the earth's work, not from the farmers. The earth is the central character in this story. The land produced. Now, central to the parable is the wealthy landowner's internal dialogue, which is a parody of wrong thinking, despite the fact that it sounds exactly like most financial counseling today. The farmer's singular concern with the gift of agricultural surplus is how he can store it and consume it privately. Note the proliferation of the first person singular. What shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops. I know what I'll do. I'll pull down my barn. I'll store my grain and my goods. I will say to my soul. The only actual dialogue here is with himself. He lives almost in a solipsistic world. The last verb, eat, drink, and be merry, in the famous parlance, the Greek verb euphraino, to make merry in a feast, is used of another Lucan rich man to describe the decadent Dives, who feasted sumptuously every day while Lazarus starved at his gate. Below the surface of this story is the issue of how this farmer acquired his prosperity. He, of course, sees it as an entitlement, but it was widely understood in antiquity that inordinate wealth usually followed from the expropriation of smallholders' land through debt default. I bet you've heard that one before. In Jesus' view, then, the farmer's bumper crop should have occasioned redistribution to those in need as reparation. Instead, however, this farmer proposes to lay his surplus up for many years, suggesting that he may be stockpiling grain against future lean times when prices would be driven up and profits increased. While this may seem like a no-brainer to our market logic, the rich man's bigger barns strategy is clearly suspect in light of the instructions of Exodus 16, not to accumulate the gift, but to keep it circulating. This parable is, in other words, a classic illustration of pleonexia, greed. That's why the punchline comes sharply and unequivocally. God calls the farmer a fool. This reveals the parable as a kind of a midrash on two older Hebrew Bible texts. The psalmist speaks of the practical atheism of those who live in contempt of the great economy and of the poor. The fool says in his heart there is no God. They have no knowledge, those who eat up my people like bread. Or perhaps even more to the point, the prophet Jeremiah declares, like the partridge hatching what it did not lay, so are all of those who amass wealth unjustly. In midlife it will leave them, and at the end they will prove to be fools. So you can see how this is a midrash on those texts, trying to bring that old wisdom to life in a new context. The parable ends, ironically, with the very question with which this sequence began, a dispute over inheritance. These things you have prepared, whose will they be? Jesus' conclusion makes explicit the contrast between the two economies. So it is with those who treasure up for themselves and consequently are not rich in the sight of God. The logic here is that the great economy of nature, as Wendell Berry puts it, precedes us and will survive us. Private accumulation is therefore a desperate but ultimately short-term hedge against the inevitable economic redistribution that comes with mortality. There's a reason why they call them hedge funds, folks. Conversely, the divine commonwealth is the thing that endures and therefore the only treasure of any actual value. This negative object lesson of the rich farmer suggests that our ownership paradigm needs to be shifted from me to we. The first part of Luke's meditation on greed is a call to economic justice. The second part now turns to the deeper underpinnings of such a call, the cosmology of grace. For this reason, Jesus says, I'm telling you, don't be anxious. Friends, this is not a suggestion. It's a prohibition. It's in the imperative. Warnings against anxiety are a refrain throughout the teaching that now follows. The contrast between Jesus' counsel and the rich farmer's self-referential strategy is striking. Rich man says, I will say to my suke, take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Jesus says, don't be anxious for your psuche, what you will eat, or about your body. Jesus now proposes a counter-imperative. Consider the birds and flowers. This is a parallel doublet, each example followed by an assurance about how God cares for us and a reiteration not to be anxious. It's very elegantly structured, as you can see. Each of the two counter-imperatives uses the Greek term katenoesate, which is an aorist imperative which commands action here and now. So Jesus isn't saying, on your off days, on your Sierra Club hike, you might want to go and smell the flowers. It's not that sort of consider. It is better translated, turn your attention to this instead, right? We're distracted by this anxious, addictive, alienating economy, and Jesus is trying to snap our attention back to something else. But of course, paying careful attention to birds and flowers is exactly what we modern folk have no intention of doing. Indeed, this is where we check out in church. Isn't it quaint? Jesus is a botanist and a bird watcher. Very sweet. Got nothing to do with real economics. Unfortunately for us, to dismiss Jesus here is to miss the key to his alternative cosmology. Jesus is likely pointing out these positive object lessons as he's walking through a field with his disciples. The truth